Okay. So just for clarity, I am going to start with a new project. So I'm going to hit add, and on here, I'm going to select project. And we're going to just name it BB07. And this is going to be project for report with POs, and that's processing options. And for the type, I don't much pay attention to this. I just know I type in a 0 and a 1 and those come out enhancements. It's going to be a 55, and release, I just type in E and it knows to load the proper thing for me. And I'm going to say okay. I now have my project here, project for a report with POs. Nothing in it yet, so I'm going to highlight objects and hit add. And I'm going to start a batch application. And we're all going to call it R5501. It's going to be a 55 means it's custom. The 01 means it's going to be based on address book. And then I'm going to just add WPO for with processing options. And report with processing options. I'm going to make sure it's an update report, and product code is 55. And I'm going to say okay. And it's going to build the object name R5501WPO. And if I were to actually go and open up a second, well, no, we won't do that. So I'm going to go into the design tab and go to report design aid. And since it's the first time I'm going in for this report, the report director is going to pop up for me. I'm going to make this I'm just going to make it a columnar group with page header, leave that as default. I'm going to add the page one of, say next, and then I'm going to find my own business view and hit next. And I don't remember what it is we've been selecting. I know it starts with VO101. And let's see, address book full view is good enough for me. So I'm just going to select that one. I can either hit next, or I think I can hit double click. Yes, and double click is the same thing as selecting it and hitting next. And so I'm going to just throw some fields in here. We're going to do address number, alpha name. Let's throw in a business unit. Let's throw in language, search type, credit message, looks interesting. And let's see if there's any other things that really look interesting for me. Let's do person corporation code. And I'm gonna hit next. That all looks good to me. Data sequencing. We're gonna base it on the alpha name. And so I'm gonna put alpha name over there and say next. And that looks good to me. So I'm gonna hit next. It's gonna say, what's my data selection? And I'm just gonna not put any data selection in right now. I just have to remember when I go to run it, I don't want to not put in any data selection for it to run wide open. So I want to be careful with that. And I'm going to have it create a version of this report, and it's going to be BB0001, and I'm going to go finish. Okay, so there's my report. And in fact, I'm going to go ahead and save it, and I'm going to go ahead and exit. And right here, it will, when I hit OK, it'll create the version. So I'm going to go into my project and see that it's added both the template and the version. Okay, so I can go ahead and run this, and I can either do it by going back into the design tab and go over to version list, or I can do it a different way. And I'm going to I just want to expose you to this. I'm going to go in here on FastPath, and I'm going to type in BV for batch versions. And I'm going to hit the enter key, and it's going to take me to batch versions, which is really the same thing. If I go into my design, the object management workbench, and hit version list, it'll take me to that same screen. So now I'm going to go ahead and type in the batch application object name, which is R5501. And then I said with processing options. So I'm going to do a find on that. It finds the version it created for me. And we're going to run it real quick. So I'm going to select this, and then I don't want to run it wide open, so I'm going to change the data selection. And since now with you guys in Demo Junior, you don't have to do this because it'll always run locally for you guys. But for me, since I'm on somebody's system, it won't run locally, and I want it to run locally. So I'm going to go into advanced override location. Okay. And then I'm going to submit it, and it's going to start processing this stuff. And it's saying, okay, first you wanted to override the location. So I'm going to select local. And then it says, oh, you also selected data select. And so I'm going to say where my search type, and if I look for search type down here, that's my AT1. So I'm going to say word search type is equal to, and I'm just going to select E for employee and say okay. Now that has finished out my data selection criteria, so I'll hit OK. And it'll go say, okay, anything else? No, I'm ready. Do you want me to display it on the screen? I'm going to say okay. And then I'm going to wait here while it runs, and it looks like it did 45 pages. And there's my information. Okay. Now, if I want to run this again for customer, I can do that. So under batch versions, I'm going to double click this time instead of highlighting and hitting select. Double click it, highlight data selection, advanced override, okay, submit, local. And now I'm going to say in the data selection where search type is equal to, and let's see what other options we have. I'm looking for vendors, so I think it's a V, but that's not always the case. And yes, it is the case in this case. So I'm going to double click that. And it's going to return that value into my single value. I'll say okay. And so I've completed the data selection. I'll say okay. I want to run it on, should display it on screen. So I hit okay. It runs. And this time it was 208 pages. So here's all my vendors. Here's all my employees. Okay. Now I'm going to show you a different way. I want to attach a processing option to this report. So the first thing I have to do is create a processing option. So under Object Management Workbench, I'm going to go back to the main screen of Object Management Workbench. So I'll say OK. And I'm going to highlight the project. I'm going to add a processing option. Now, this is going to be really weird because processing option is a version of a data structure. So I'm going to highlight data structure and say OK. And then when I give it the object name and description, you'll see over here, I can make a regular data structure, which is used when we create a business function, or I can select processing option template. And so that's what I'm going to select. Now, since it's a processing option, I want to use the similar naming convention that I've been using, that an application starts with P, a report starts with R. And since processing option template technically starts with a P, but P is already in use, I'm going to, processing options typically start with a T. And I want to associate it with that report. So I'm going to give it the same name as the report template, which was R5501WPO. And I'm going to give it starting with a T. And then I'm going to say test report processing options. Okay. Product code's going to be 55, just like usual. It copies down, and I'm going to say OK. Now, let me pause here a second to make sure you understand what it is we're about to do. So what I'm going to do is I'm creating this template so I can specify the search type that gets auto added to this report so that it knows which version, which type of data I want to display. Now, do you guys remember what the alias for that search type is?
No.
It was AT1, if you remember it. So if AT1 is the alias, so we're going to remember that. I'm going to go into design tools and notice our display is a little different here. I can start the processing option designing. And so this is a processing option. Now, just for clarity, let me give you an idea of what a processing option looks like in finished mode. And I'm going to go back to batch versions, and I'm going to pull up R0101 something. I actually need to look this up. So it's going to be R0101. This is address book. And I don't quite remember the name, but there's address book batch upload. So that's good enough to that should have processing options. So I'm going to load it up in the filter field and I'm going to do a find. And there's two different versions here. Now, I don't know if it's going to let me look at these. These are kind of reserved versions. So it may not let me look. Oh, yeah, it does. Okay. So it lets me look at the processing options. Now, I know nothing about this report other than what I'm reading here. And so I can guess that this report puts some sort of, runs an address book master business function here. And that master business function also has a version, and you have to specify it so it knows to call the right master business function. And then that's the version tab. And in the process tab, there's a process that says, oh, if I leave this field blank, it's going to pretend it's running it and maybe do all the checks and balances that it does if I leave it blank. So that's just proving that it works, that we've put valid data in there. Or in final mode, it's actually going to finalize whatever it is. That seems kind of scary to me, so I'm not going to run this. But this is so you can see what processing options look like in final mode. This is, compare this with the design mode, looks kind of like this. So I am going to, I was going to try and display this side by side. So here's the tab. We're going to add some stuff to this, just like this. And while this is a real big one, it's going to look something like this. Okay, so stay with me there. I'm going to cancel that. And back in my processing option design mode, I want to give this a name. And so I'm going to hold my cursor over the tab and right mouse click. And then I'm going to say current tab properties. And I'm going to specify, instead of new tab, I want it to say, these are my defaults. And so I'm going to say defaults and say okay. And the tab is going to change to defaults. And so what I want to put in here is that search type, which is AT1. So I'm going to look under alias for AT1. I'm going to hit the enter key and it brings up that search type. So I'm going to drag and drop it over here and it puts in the default search type. You know, I could just leave it just like this and say I'm done. But I want it to be user friendly. So I'm going to change some information about this. So I am going to right mouse click in this area where this entry was added. And I'm going to go to properties. And this is going to give me the name of this processing option when I go in to do any coding. And I'm gonna change this. I'm gonna just say it's address type, and I'm going to give it the alias name AT1, just so I know. It better helps me remember what type it is if I come back 6 months later. And if I go to label text, it doesn't let me change it here, darn it. So what I have to do, I went ahead and said, okay. If I go in and click close to this, now looks like I can change things. So I'm going to backspace everything and start from scratch. And I'm going to say, for the first processing option, I'm going to say, enter the search type code for this report. And I'm going to hit a colon, just so they know they're expecting some action. So I'm going to click out of there. That looks like good to start with. So I'm going to hit the save. And then I'm going to file and exit this. And I have my processing option. Let me get away from work with batch version. So I'm back at OMW and I say, okay. And then let's see where I am in the project. And there's my processing option. And so now I need to attach my processing option to the report once I've created it. So I'm going to go back into my report design by hitting design, design tools, start report design aid. And then in my report, I'm going to start looking around. Oh, let's see, select processing options. That's exactly what I need. So I'm going to click on that and it's going to say, what processing options do I want? Well, if I remember, it's T5501 something. So I'm going to, in the filter field, I'm going to put an asterisk and see if that narrows it down enough for me. And it does, it narrows it down to 1. So I'm going to highlight that option and hit OK. And now the report has attached the processing options. And if I go back up here, I can see that there's a check mark next to it saying that there are processing options attached. And boy, I went to click on that again and it doesn't tell me anything. Oh, but if I go to report properties and look in there, I can say, oh, there's my processing options. And that test report processing option doesn't tell me a whole lot, but when I put my cursor in there, I know that the cursor's in there. And if I use my arrow keys and go all the way to the right, oh, it gives me the object name that I've included. So I'm good with that. So I know there's processing options. So now, unfortunately, we're still not there yet. So even though there's processing options, I'm going to hit save and I'm going to hit exit. And then if I go back to my batch versions and type in that report and do a find, I go up here, and if I look at processing options, there's my processing options. So I can now hit like employee for that. The only problem is when I go to run this, I'm going to look at data selection, but I'm not going to change anything. I'm going to hit advanced, so it's running local. And then I'm going to hit submit. And I'm just going to say okay and see what happens. See if that processing option is in there. No, I can't do that because just because I've added a processing option, it doesn't know what to do with that yet. So I've got some more work to do. So I don't want to run this wide open. So I have to do some more to this. So I'm going to go back into my object management workbench and go back into Design Aid and see if I can add that to the data selection of this report. So in order to do that, I have to go into event rules. So I'm going to right mouse click and select event rules. And in the initialize section is where I have to attach data selection. So I'm just going to put in a blank comment line there. And then I'm going to go to system functions and I'm going to go into general. And the first thing I'm going to do is set selection append flag. And I'm going to say, I want to add data selection. I want to add some programmatic. I'm going to program the search type in there, but I don't want to, if somebody has some of their own data selection, I want to complement it, not replace it. So I'm going to say append flag. I'm going to say yes and say okay. Now I'm going to bring the processing option into play by doing another system command under the general, which is set user selection. And I'm going to say, I want the search type. Where's my search type? There's search type. Search type to be set equal to, and then I want it to be set to that processing option. And hopefully we have that processing option here. It's a PO. There's my processing option type. And then just for now, I'm going to say and I pretty much always just use and. We'll talk about what this and or none does after you're much more experienced with doing processing options. So I'm going to say okay. And so now I have in the initialize section, it's going to say set selection append flag, yes. And what it's going to do is it's going to add search type of whatever the processing option is. So let's give that a try. And I'm going to save this. Now there's another caveat that I haven't told you about yet. And this is something, and a mistake you're going to hit several times when you're brand new to this. So I'm going to save and exit. Is when I go to run that report, I'm going to look at it. And if I go into version detail, there is prompting of blank. And what that says is when it's blank, it thinks there's no processing options. So it's not even going to ask you for them. And if you don't go into that version and say prompt for values, I'm going to select that and it's going to put a 2 in the prompting, then you'll be entering processing options and they don't seem to register in the report and you have trouble figuring out why until someone says, well, if you created this version before you actually attach processing options, it's going to default it to blank and it's not going to think there's processing options. So with processing options, I'm going to say 2 and say okay. And now when I go to start this, I'm going to double click on it. I'm going to look at data selection and I'm going to run it locally like we have been. But it's going to be something new. It shows me the data selection and I'm okay with that. So I'm just going to say, okay, wide open. But now processing options show up and it's going to set it for E and I'm going to say, okay, and on screen. And it comes up with all the employees on that report. So voila, I didn't have to go through that data selection. So that saves me some time. Now, I'm going to go to batch versions here and I'm going to go, well, you know what? I really want to have this. It's okay if it defaults to employees, but I want the users to be able to run it instead of having to enter something every time. I just want it to be the default. I'm going to hit cancel here because sometimes they just want to have it run without doing that. So I'm going to copy this version. I'm going to say copy this version and I'm going to make it BB0002 and I'm going to call this report for employees. And I'm going to say, okay. I'm going to look at the processing option value. It's an E already, so I'm going to say, okay. And so now I have a second version here, report for employees. Now, since I know it, the only thing in there is setting it up for employees, I'm going to go to version detail and say, I want it to be blind execution. I want you to read the processing options, but I don't want you to present them to the user for him or her to change. So I'm changing this to a 1, blind execution. And I'm going to go run it. And again, I could do data selection, advanced, override, okay, submit, local. And look, this time the processing option didn't come up. It goes straight to the, are you ready to display it on screen? Hit okay, boom, employee. Now, what's really cool about this is I can now say, okay, I want to see vendors. So I'm going to copy this for vendors. And I'm going to make a version 3 report for vendors. Okay. I'm going to change the value here to a V. I'm going to say, okay, there's my report for vendors. I'm going to double click it, run it locally. Boom, there's vendors. Okay. And then this just leaves me all kinds of additional things. I can copy it again. BB04. And I can say report for customers. And say, okay, I'm going to set the processing option value to whatever customers is, and it usually C, but I wanted to make sure. Ooh, and there's competitors too. So that might be worth one to make as well. So customers, I'm going to select that and say, okay. And I'm not going to run that right now, but I have reports for customers. I'm going to copy it again for that competitors. Make it BB05. Report for competitors. I'm going to change the processing option, in this case, to a D and say, okay. Now, I think I'm going to try and run that, see what happens. I can run it, takes me to that screen you're used to seeing. Advanced override, okay, submit, local. Did not prompt me for that value. And I'm going to say okay and see what pops up. And nothing popped up, but I noticed no data selected. So they probably don't keep track of competitors in their database. So there we have it. If I wanted to fix that, I might go in to, let me do a new find. Here's all my reports. I'm going to change this one since there's no output for competitors. Actually, I want to report for competitors. I want to change that to something else. I don't know what that something else is yet, but I'm going to say okay. And I'm going to go into processing option. Let's figure out what other option I have here. Investors or jobs. Let's do jobs. So I'm going to do jobs. I'll remember this is jobs. Let's try running it. And look, there's jobs. So that's good. Okay, there's the search type of J. Search type, so jobs, there are jobs out there. So cool. We've got that. I can go back into Object Management Workbench, highlight this, go into version detail and change it to report for jobs. And I'm going to say okay. All right. Any questions on what I've done here?
No,
Chris,
not really.
does it make sense what I've done?
I think so.
Okay. Not talking, there's Chris. You're good with this?
Makes sense. Makes sense.
Okay. So I'm going to, now we're going to go through it together. And hopefully, but since it takes so long, I'm not going to record this portion of the thing. Is that all right?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. So I am going to, come on. Or stop recording.